We are at the chapter titled The Evolution of the Spiritual Man in Sri Aurobindo's Life Divine, where, having first shown us the larger movement of evolution and the emergence of the human mind in general evolution, Sri Aurobindo now brings the focus to the evolution of the spiritual consciousness in humanity, drawing upon similarities with stages of emergence of life out of matter and mind out of life. But still, all those similarities fail in the very nature of the spiritual consciousness that emerges. When that emerges, what does it do? What is it like? And there is, of course, nothing before it to give us any sense. Just as there was nothing before mind which gave us a hint of what mind could be like. And yet, there are similarities in the emergence itself, in that the first period of emergence, one cannot distinguish what is emerging from the thing out of which it is emerging. In the animal, when mind begins to organize itself, it seems almost as if a special phenomenon of life. It's only when mind has sufficiently extricated itself out of life, is standing on its own, that you can say, this is different. And still you don't know the full power of mind. After that, mind begins to take up its own proper evolution. And so in a similar sense, the first emergence of the spiritual consciousness seems to be almost a specialized working of the mind, a rarefied, special focus, consciousness, even in a sense, a special kind of feeling you feel in the heart, a kind of a special calm or joy, something pure. Or even for some, in the senses, there is something almost magical that fills the sensory experience. But in all of these, it's only a preparatory first emergence. The spirit has not yet come into its own. And we saw last time that through these three statuses, we actually break out to something which is behind mind, which is behind life and emotions, behind even the body and sensations. And it is at that point that we discover the true sense of the consciousness separate from these. Until we experience something which is not mind, not emotion or physical consciousness, we have not really touched the spiritual. We are close to, we are approaching, we are mixed in, but not free in it. So this, we saw last time, is a stage where you could pause halfway in the Purusha in the mind, Purusha in the life, or Purusha in the body, but you have to go further. And this then, at first, knows only itself in relation with nature. It knows itself as if supporting or standing back from or witnessing nature, but it has only that relationship. And after that, it can even know itself as independent. No more soul looking at nature, no more soul even with power to influence or put a close control on our nature. There is, after that, a kind of a deep silence or stillness in the whole being, which is unaffected by these movements of nature. And at that time, we can become aware of a self, a spiritual substance of our being. It has substantiality. It is not a withdrawal into some kind of rarefied mental abstraction. It has its own substantiality, which is even more dense, more real, more concrete than any of these things we've experienced in nature. And he says, an existence exceeding even the soul individuality, spreading itself into universality. And at that point we can see the first character of spirit proper. So far it was still something special or even something different still inside the personality or associated with the personality. And now it breaks beyond the boundaries, acquires this sense of universality. In the universality, for the first time, you can say, but I am not body. I am so much greater. I am free from body to such a degree that even it seems as if I could exist permanently with or without body. There's an incident I have narrated before when Swami Vivekananda first left his body. He appeared to one of his very close disciples in Chennai, one of the senior disciples, and appeared in vision and said to him, I have spat out my body. Very interesting formulation. In the consciousness which is, you already are, and universal, everywhere in the universe is within you in that sense, and the body was like a little focal point or a knot of matter inside. And what did you do? You disengaged from it, and there's also almost this sense of throwing it out. Our viewpoint from inside the body is, the soul left the body. The body is here and the soul has gone away. Actually, it's the reverse. The spirit is always there. It can go nowhere. It is the body which has been disconnected from it. And even a glimpse of that status, of a universality beyond the soul individuality, immediately gives us the sense of permanence, the assurance that we are immortal, that whatever may happen in terms of external circumstances, nothing can change, nothing can affect. After all, your consciousness includes the universe, is greater than the universe. Nothing in the universe, even the entire universe appearing or disappearing, wouldn't change anything. So, an existence exceeding even the soul individuality, spreading itself into universality, surpassing all dependence on any natural form or action, extending itself upward into a transcendence of which the limits are not visible. And this is the other aspect of beyond the universality. So you see, soul has three statuses. The individualized status, where you are the center of this triple mind, life, body complex. The second, which is the poise of universality, where even the universe is within you. And there's a third, which is the sense of a transcendence, as if you go beyond, and even the sense of going beyond space, beyond time, unendingly into a transcendence. And it is when a power of the transcendence enters that it can bring about the transformation. It can bypass the limitations of universality and the laws of the universe even to create a radical change. So these three things he has described. It is these liberations of the spiritual part in us which are the decisive steps of the spiritual evolution in nature. When these three things have happened, that we can say that the spiritual evolution in nature has taken a basis for itself. There is no turning back. There is no falling back into what was. But after that, there is still more that it does. The spiritual evolution has only set a base. So just as in the first emergence of mind, there was a station where mind came into its own, but then it had to develop all its faculties and powers, and so much more that has to follow. In the same way, spirit also goes through a further development. Now, all of this, remember, is in response to the two questions Sri Aurobindo placed before us. First, what is it that is the nature of the transition from mental being to spiritual being? And we are getting a sense of this. What is the spiritual being like? But second question, which will follow after this, is that what is the process and method of the evolution of the spiritual out of the mental? That there's obviously something, some process, some method, and understanding that we will then be able to participate and speed it up. But all that will make sense when we have an idea of what it is growing towards. What is this spiritual being as distinct from mental being? And now we have got a first foundation where he says it is a decisive step of the spiritual evolution. What happens next? It is only through these decisive movements that the true character of the evolution becomes evident. For till then, there are only preparatory movements. What are those preparatory movements? And this is what we have to catch in ourselves. We will recognize each of these may be in a soft, mild, initial, mixed working in us because they are all there. For anybody who has taken to the spiritual life, who is drawn to anything of the spirit, to whatever degree, something of these movements will be already present. Recognizing them is extremely important now. For till then, there are only preparatory movements. First, a pressure of the psychic entity on the mind, life, and body to develop a true soul action. Second, a pressure of the spirit or self for liberation from the ego. Third, from the ego, from the surface ignorance. And third, a turning of the mind and life towards some occult reality. And these Sri Aurobindo describes as preliminary experiences, partial formulations of a spiritualized mind, a spiritualized life, but no complete change, no probability of an entire unveiling of the soul or self, or a radical transformation of the nature. So we will recognize these initial steps for what they are, and they can be, at the very least, preliminary experiences. As they grow and become more complete, they acquire partial formulations of a spiritualized mind. Your mind is now being formed by the influence of the spirit. It is being spiritualized, but only partially. It hasn't come into its own yet. And even a spiritualized life, which is partially formed, but no complete change. And a complete change would have this character that the soul would be entirely unveiled, or the self would be entirely unveiled, or there will be a radical transformation of the nature. None of these three things are possible at that stage, in this partial development. And yet the partial will be for us a first base. If this much has not happened, well, the rest will not happen yet. So we will give extreme importance to these three. And let's look at what they are again. First, a pressure of the psychic entity, he puts a capital E, meaning the psychic being. Daemon in the Greek vocabulary, the individualized divine within us. The pressure of the psychic entity on the mind, life, and body to develop a true soul action. So first there is a pressure. The pressure can be on the mind, or it can be on the life impulses, or even it can be on the body. And on different types of human beings, it could be any one of these, or sometimes more than one, or even all three. But what is the pressure trying to do? What is it nudging things towards? To develop a true soul action. What does that mean? First, what is soul action? And then we will recognize what is true soul action. So the first sense of soul action is that it is not ego action. It is not desire action. What are our prime motivators in life? Why do we do things? What makes us do what we do? And when we begin to introspect that, we discover almost everything we do is in terms of, most often, a reaction. Something happens, I react. Something else happens, I react. The bulk of our life is reaction or automation. I get up in the morning, I go through my process, I shower, I clothe myself, I eat, I go. But at no point did I do it consciously, with an intention. It was almost like a robot. And then every now and then something doesn't happen. So I discover as I'm going to put some meal on my plate that, it's finished. And at that point I have a reaction. A reaction of upset or choosing to get the food which is missing or making some arrangement, but in response to that situation only. I walk, I'm mechanical, robot-like, until I bump into something or I trip, and then there's a reaction. I meet somebody and I'm talking endlessly, mechanically. You're sitting in a shared vehicle or you sit in an office and you greet each other, good morning, how are you, how was your day? It's all mechanical. You're not conscious of what you're saying most of the time. It's until somebody says something odd and suddenly your mind snaps out of the mechanism and says, what's this? And briefly, momentarily again, a reaction. So the first thing we recognize is the bulk of our life is really reactive. It's not even action and it's not even soul action. That is yet to follow. So the first step to make it action will become a conscious awareness, even in mind, where I begin to do everything deliberately, intentionally. Just that is a huge step. And it's a culturing of the mental consciousness itself and a refining of the mind, even a part of the civilizing of the higher ranges of the mental consciousness, to do everything with full awareness. Basic practices which you will see, which are very popular today, what they call mindfulness practices or exercises, being in the now, being in the here and now, with full attention on the activity you do, are all helpful to that. But again, at best they get you to a poise of mental action. And so we have to now distinguish this from soul action. The character of non-soul action is that it is ego action, meaning I do because I need, I want. The center of emergence is the sense of I, which is the ego. What's wrong with that? The only problem is the ego sense is not an absolute. It's not a fixed center. It is a bundle of currently operating pulls and pushes of habits, desires and impulses. And that is changing all the time. So the problem of my ego action is, I want this now, I really want it. And a short while later, no, I'm not interested, I don't need it. Or I don't want it, I want that. And in the very same hour, it can find itself wanting two contradictory things. Feeling two contradictory things. You are such a wonderful person, I feel so grateful to you. And then after a while, this fellow, he's no good, I'm upset with him, or he needs a nice knock. And it changed because I just discovered something else. My basis for relationship of whether you are nice or not nice is my self-interest. To the extent that you helped me, you were nice. To the extent that you did something behind my back which harmed me, now you are my enemy, or at least you are not nice. The reference point is the little center of my self-interest. What's wrong with that again? The problem with that is when each one of us meets with our little self-interest as focal points, we are always in collision. And so the basis of a harmonious life is impossible when your center is self-interest that is unstable and changing at all times. Today I'm in a generous mood. I say yes to anybody who comes. Tomorrow I'm upset and I say no to everybody who comes. What value has that? So the test of its value is seen not just in terms of self-interest but in the collective space. And if I were to shift my poise, and I'm not yet speaking of the soul, I shift my poise to some deeper principle. What's good for everybody? Let's start with family. What's good for my family? And sometimes what's good for me may conflict with what's good for my family, and I set aside what's good for me. And say, all right, it doesn't matter. I am happier if I could make everyone in my family happy, or my dependents, or my loved ones. Now expand the sense of family to your immediate circle, your team, your friends, your community, your society, whatever, clan, tribe, nation. And at that point, you are actually setting aside smaller ego for larger ego, which is a great step, but it is still ego. And the problem with that is, at some point, your nation will conflict with another nation's interest. It still does not have a basis of true harmony or something which is true in itself. But it's a step. At some point, you realize it's not even about me, it's not even about family, it's about what's the right thing to do in this situation. And I can be in a mental consciousness still, not yet aware of soul. And from my mind, I say, what's the best for all concerned? Forget my tribe, forget my nation, not even humanity, for all concerned, including animals, nature, for the future of earth. What's the best for all concerned? And I choose to do that. You can see at that point you have definitely moved beyond not even narrow personal ego, beyond even a collective ego. You are attempting now to translate the sense of an underlying self-existent truth into action. In the yoga tradition, we will call this dharma. In the Buddhist tradition, because a divine truth or a divine will has been removed, the idea of divine is removed, they will speak of it as natural law. But the idea is similar, that there is as if a right relation, a right arrangement at each moment, where the right action will be the thing to do and would lead to the best result. Dharma. But still, now the problem. So far we have come very close to true action. But my problem is, I don't always know what is the right action, what is that best dharma. I try my best, but my tools for knowledge are my mind. And with the mind, if I start arguing, I can justify any position. So if I am deceiving myself, I can slant my dharma this way, that way, to justify what suits me or my desire. And it's mixed. But if I am sincere, I say, well, let me feel what is this right thing, because it exists independent of me. And the moment I begin to feel that, there's a glimpse. And it could be an intuitive glimpse as if of something beyond the mind, from above. Or it could be an inner psychic touch which awakes from within, yes, this feels right. And that's our first step towards true soul action. And at each point, I may pause and feel what's the right thing to do. What's the best, what is most true, and the sense of something essentially right, independent of all interests and desires, now begins to fill my consciousness and begins to lead it. This is what will bring us to first, soul action, because the influence is from that deeper intimation of the soul's perception, which sees what is true, what is right. And it's a true action because it is not egocentric, desire-based, unstable, or relative. It has a character of an absoluteness to itself. We won't use the word absolute because at each moment it changes. There's a right action now and I can do it. If I miss it, the moment passes, things change, and 10 minutes later the situation has changed so much, the right action may be something completely different. It flows with circumstances. At each moment the rightness may shift. So it's not really, absolute is not the word, but still it is true in itself. And when increasingly it is felt by the deeper soul, it becomes true soul action. Now, when we live in the soul's consciousness, or when the soul's consciousness begins to lead our personality, that is what it seeks to live by. Now this idea which we have developed, I used the word dharma, taken to its essential will be what we will say the divine will at each moment. From the soul's experience, from the psychic being, it is serving the divine truth, the divine will. At each moment, the divine is trying to manifest, to fulfill, to express, to manifest himself. And I try to align myself to that, to be true to that, and live for that, by that. This experience becomes so much more vivid and complete and even objective when the soul consciousness comes forward, because it knows that at each moment. And therefore the soul's influence on the mind, on life and body is always to bring these three into alignment with this. If we live more in the mind, or if our mind is more sensitive to the sense of truths, to the sense of beauty, to the sense of right, and we have already cultivated this sense of looking at things more objectively, not personally, not ego and desire centrically, then already there is a climate created in the mind for the soul to put out that influence and push a pressure of the psychic entity on mind to develop a true soul action. But we've created a climate in which that pressure can come out and freely lead the mind. But the same thing can be experienced in the life, in the heart particularly. And for those who don't live too much in the mind but who feel from the heart, it may begin with a sentimentality. And in the sentimental, let it be. In the sentimentality, we discover that there is a kind of a deeper sentimentality. Something which feels more truly right. And so initially, one may begin with an emotional sentimentality which is largely ego-based. But if there is a refinement of the emotions, if there is a sense of looking beyond to something deeper, truer or higher, then through the emotions, a kind of a deeper sensitivity grows, which as if exceeds the personal sentimentality. And if it is accompanied by culturing of bhakti and of love for the divine, then it creates again a climate for the soul's influence, the psychic entity, to fill the heart and through the heart work to develop the true soul action. A similar thing is also possible in the body. And to those who are much more in the realm of feeling of body and action and serving through physical action in the spirit of karma, yoga, even without the conscious attempt to do a karma yoga, the sense of doing the work and feeling joy in the work well done, to make the work more beautiful, to make it more perfect, already in it a sense awakens of the right action. And if there is at that point a conscious attempt to develop that feel, to bring even into it a sense of the service and the joy of the service, the feeling of an instrument, and all the things which follow in the karma yoga, even if not consciously intended, that creates a climate in the physical will and senses that allows in the body consciousness the sense of that discrimination. It feels right. You start doing something and you feel something not okay, and you do what is right. And this brings the psychic entity and its pressure to develop a true soul action. Now, this need not be always in the realm of karma. It can also be in any skill. A musician, for example, when he learns to play, let's take a person who plays the piano. If there has been the culturing of consciousness, as the fingers move, you will see the person's body as if moves, as if dancing. The person goes, the body gently expresses, and the fingers follow, almost like a dance. And you can feel as if an inspiration works and the body moves. And in the body consciousness, one has developed a kind of a refinement and a sensitization in which the soul influence could begin to fill it, and the music could catch the sense. And literally you feel as if your fingers do the right thing at that moment. All of these are forms in which this pressure of the psychic entity can build. So the first preparatory movement is this pressure felt. But eventually and distinctly, there is this sense of something deeper which leads, which fills, which guides to what is more true and emerging from the soul. The second influence then builds on the first, although it could come independently, which is a pressure of the spirit or self for liberation from the ego, from the surface ignorance. The character of this is much less personal. It can be felt as if a pressure from above or a sense of something behind which is larger, vaster. Even it may create a sense of a duality within. There's a part of me that is this very ignorant, instinctive, reactive person, but there's a deeper part of me which is so different, so free, so mature, so large, so generous, free, unaffected, undisturbed, equal, etc. And the sense of that is the pressure from there to let go of this narrow, egocentric reaction. And with it, the stupidity and foolishness of the surface priorities, impulses, and drives. Against that backdrop, which somehow has such a sense of a deeper wisdom. And so at first, one feels something larger, I don't know what, but against which I feel so small. And rather than being stuck in the small and wanting to break out of that larger feeling, one accepts the larger as oneself. And one begins to lean in it or draw upon it or draw from it. Sometimes it can take a distinct form, which, as I discussed earlier, literally there's two of me. There's this little me playing around like a little kid, and there's this larger, mature me which is from behind. But then I have a choice. I can lean back more in that, and it feels great, it feels free, but I don't have those passionate drives which I feel on the surface. Or occasionally, a crisis, a conflict pulls me out onto the surface, narrow part, and there's a kind of an oscillation between these two states. But the influence of that is also a pressure, but a liberation from ego and surface ignorance. You're not free from ignorance truly, but from the surface, petty, narrow, ignorant tendency, and inside there may be a larger consciousness which may still have its own ignorance, but no more narrow. And then the third, as a result of these two, but it can also happen separately, a turning of the mind and life towards some occult reality. By now one has experienced this deeper soul or self as an experience, and you begin to yearn for it, you begin to long for it. Even if it is in glimpses, you're always looking for that. I've seen people who have no obvious spiritual seeking, but who, not realizing what it is, are seeking for this deeper reality through certain types of activity. And one of the most common ones is an activity where you go out into nature all alone, but particularly in vast spaces of nature. You go trekking, you go on top of a mountain, you go sometimes into a forest, on the edge of the ocean or the lake, or out on the sea in a boat all alone. All of these, what do you do? He's not reading a book. I just feel good, I feel connected, I feel whole, I feel complete, whatever the way the person describes. They are really experiences of a first glimpse of a deeper reality with which you are now beginning to enter in communion. But it is hidden. And so you use these surface forms of nature as entry points. There are others who may do this with animals. They go to a safari, but they're looking for the animals. They may or may not feel the animals or see the animal at all on that day. There's a disappointment. But just the act of being in the space of the animals and looking for them, somehow you break out of your narrowness. And if you have a brief glimpse, look, there's a herd of elephant. I saw a lion there, and then it turned and it looked at me in the eye, and I felt this shiver of a thrill. Momentarily you have connected to something which is deeper, but these are as if gateways. And people don't realize that this is what it is that they're looking for. a turning of the mind and life towards some occult reality, capital R. Why capital R? What does it mean? We are experiencing reality, but our reality is as if relative, unstable, insecure. Whatever seems to be real now, tomorrow could be proved to be entirely false. And after it's proved to be false, you may discover that even that was not true. There's something else further. Nothing is secure, nothing is known. Nothing exists in itself by itself. All depends on everything else for its value. The value of an object. This is a rare trophy. Very valuable, costs so many millions. Why? Oh, look at that signature, look at that little scratch, see the date here, see that sign. That is what is authenticity. You're dependent on a sign. Tomorrow if somebody erases the sign, its value is gone. But is there something intrinsic to it? You can't find it. But when you meet a person, a truly gem of a person, you say, this person is something so good, so precious. People like that, dependent on what? There's an innate goodness. But this is still dependent on what you've felt perhaps, which may be half secure. But when you meet this deeper reality, it is always existent in itself. Its value is in terms of itself, not dependent on anything else. All the rest could change. When you meet this reality, it is simply. Even a small glimpse of this is enough to say, this is worth it. But that's the reason why people keep going to those special treks or ocean in the boat or meeting the animals, some glimpse of that which you come back as something inherently valuable in itself. Whenever you remember it, even the memory brings back something of the touch of that value. So, towards some occult reality, we don't yet meet the reality. It is hidden, it is behind the scenes, but you can glimpse through the forms. If you have had this touch of this true soul action, if you have experienced the pressure of the self for liberation from the surface, ego and ignorance, then you've already had a glimpse of that. But even without those, you could have had a glimpse. So he is describing three very different experiences. All three can, so to say, nurture each other, whatever your starting point. But there are three distinct, different directions. But all these are still preliminary experiences, partial formulations of a spiritualized mind, a spiritualized life. And so through these, you have had the spiritualization begun. But it does not have the power to directly reveal the self or the soul or come into its own to change nature radically. These are touches, preliminary. At some point though, there will be an emergence. When will you know that? When there is the decisive emergence, one sign of it is the status or action in us of an inherent, intrinsic, self-existent consciousness which knows itself by the mere fact of being, knows all that is in itself in the same way, by identity with it, begins even to see all that to our mind seems external in the same manner, by a movement of identity or by an intrinsic direct consciousness which envelops, penetrates, enters into its object, discovers itself in the object, is aware in it of something that is not mind or life or body. There is then evidently a spiritual consciousness which is other than the mental. So here is the first decisive emergence and the sign of it. And he describes the sign of it again in degrees, in stages, even of the experience coming into completeness. So we will catch the first one. And then through the first one, the second layer or level of its emergence. And through that, the third one. First, he says, the status or action in us of an inherent, intrinsic, self-existent consciousness which knows itself by the mere fact of being. So he has used two words here for this consciousness. The status or action in us of this inherent, intrinsic consciousness. What's the difference between status or action? So for many people, especially the types who are more in the work of karma yoga and action space, the first contact with the deeper reality can be as if something entered, filled me, lifted my actions, and it made it something so extraordinary. I had no idea it was possible. It felt so good. It was so beautiful. And then it passed. And after that, my actions, which are normal, seem so insipid, hollow, empty. And I yearn and long for that, or call for that, or seek to recover that. And so what you have experienced was the action in you of this inherent, intrinsic, self-existent consciousness, but it came as an action in you. The other way, which is more natural for those who are oriented to the way of knowledge, through meditation, you enter into the status of this consciousness. It's not action, rather it's a state. And in that state you feel this exalted, self-existent, inherent, intrinsic consciousness. So it could come of both of these ways. The first, which is part of the kinetic, active aspect of this spiritual consciousness. The other, which is the more static poise and status. Depending on our temperament, one of these will be our first contact. But whichever is your first contact, you have to develop the other. And often the other may not feel comfortable because your nature is different. So for the person of action, the consciousness comes when I start doing this. Whenever I remember the divine and sweep the floor in remembrance of the divine, that begins to fill me. But the moment I stop the activity, it kind of fades out. So you have to then catch what has filled you, hold it like in a container, and carry it until it begins to saturate and becomes a state. In the other case, when in a state of deep concentration, meditation, in an exalted consciousness, you hold this, which is your state, you find the moment you move or speak or begin to work, you lose the state. So for you, entering action is the problem. And there again, you have to work consciously, keeping that poise, begin to move slowly, enter into activity without losing that poise, and begin to extend it into the dynamic movement of the same spiritual consciousness, until it can now flow and fill the activity with the same intensity and purity as you have in the poise of the static status. Between the two, there is another difference. For those who experience in the action, often there is a mixture at first, because your action necessarily involves a mix of your personal will, your life energies and emotions and personal interests of mind, and so the mixture is always there. For them to recover the poise of still status of consciousness is also a process of purification. For the other person who is more in the static poise, in inward concentration, entering an action means a loss of purity. And so for them, it's a struggle now to extend the pure action or pure consciousness all the way and purify the action itself. But you can see the starting points are different. Both eventually have to get both sides of it. But now what is special about this consciousness itself? He has used three words: inherent, intrinsic, self-existent. which knows itself by the mere fact of being. So our mental consciousness, even our emotional consciousness, and even our sensational consciousness are none of these. They are not inherent, intrinsic, or self-existent. For example, your mind or your thoughts, they don't have any value in themselves. You're aware in your mind, but your mind, what is it like? It's a constantly changing state. Your emotions are constantly shifting states. They do not have the character of existing with reference to themselves. They exist in a reference to some other state of which there is a constant shift and mix. Your knowledge, similarly, is always in relation to things. But this consciousness, as it comes forward, you recognize that it is simply I am that I am, is the way the burning bush answers to Moses when he asks, "Who are you?" I am that I am. The sense of reference to yourself. Whatever I am is in relation to what I am. There is nothing in the world against which I exist or don't exist, or by which I am made or formed, or which can therefore modify or condition me or change my value. This is what you see also in certain kinds of even material experiences or art forms or creations. A touch of this is there. The great pieces of art precisely are immortal because they stand the test of time. The fashion phases come and go in art, but the masterpieces survive all those phases because they have a touch of this, the touch of the absoluteness of the spirit, this sense of an intrinsic, self-existent value. So, self-existent, first it exists by itself, and its value is in terms of itself. Innate within it is its value. It does not bring value because it is greater than that or lesser than the other, which is the domain of our mind, emotions, and physical forms. I'm very rich because I have thousands. I have millions. A millionaire was a big name. If you look at the cinema of 30 years ago, they would have somebody come who is a millionaire, and that was wow. Today, millionaires are a dime a dozen. A billionaire, that is something. But billionaire also with unstable investments, he can lose everything overnight. Where is the inherent intrinsic value of the number? Tomorrow it will be trillionaire or centillionaire. There's nothing to it. But when the presence comes, it stands. And it stands so absolute that nothing else before it matters. And this is the character of the spiritual consciousness. So, inherent within itself, it has what it needs. Intrinsic value is within it. Self-existent, it needs nothing else to be. Consciousness, and then which knows itself by the mere fact of being. How do I know it? The very fact that it is its completeness. So you enter into that consciousness, wow, it is so complete, it is itself. Everything else somehow pales in relation to it. Because of this character, it is easy from that state to look at other relative surface movements of consciousness and view them as either valueless, ephemeral, transitory, or even as illusory. Because that is so real that this becomes illusory compared to it. Very often, in the first touch of such an experience, people suddenly say, oh, suddenly everything became unreal. Or suddenly everything felt so small and so little or pointless. I found myself losing interest in everything which I like. And so it feels wrong. It feels as if you have got into trouble because you're still looking at these things whose value has gone. And so if you ask the person, hang on, you felt everything becoming valueless. Compared to what? Was there something else which felt more valuable? And then they turn attention inward and then they say, oh yes, it felt like there was something vast or something more deep or something more real against which. You see, our habit of being turned outward is so strong that when that consciousness dawns on you, you don't even notice it. You notice only the change that has taken place in the other things that you are turned to. And it needs the culturing to turn back, that against which this changed. You're perhaps casually walking on the road. It can be in the middle of a bustling city. It doesn't need any excuse to come in. And as you're walking, suddenly something shifts and everything around you becomes unreal, as if made of cardboard, as if a set of cinema artificially constructed. Like if you could push it, it will just topple over. It's a kind of experience that comes upon us briefly. And I believe anybody who is drawn to the spiritual life has had some sense, some glimpse of this. More or less, maybe it lasted for a few minutes, for a few hours, even for a few seconds. It's one of the most common ways by which one has the sense of the dawning. But because at that time you were still obsessed with, what's happening to me, what's happening to this, you miss the other which dawned on you. If you have the conditioning or the practice of a deeper turn, you realize, there is this thing which is so deep, so great, so vast, so real. And then you catch it, and then you can hold and stay in it for a longer time. So, knows itself by the mere fact of being. And when it knows itself, no other reference required. But this is the first level. Stabilize this perception or this experience, deepen it, let it grow. And then a second level begins to dawn. Knows all that is in itself in the same way. Now, as you dwell in it, you recognize within this consciousness there are different aspects, even a sense of different qualities or powers. It is as if a deep sense of peace, or a deep sense of awareness, simply aware, or a sense of light, or just a presence, or a love, or a sense of vastness, or just a power, intense. Whatever the sense of it, they're all aspects. And each of these aspects, all that is in itself, it knows in the same way. I know because I am it, one with it, and you remain immersed in it. If you have developed by persistent effort the capacity to enter in relation with this and even enter into it, even in state of concentration or activity, one can consciously tilt the focus on these different aspects of it. In the peace, you can feel the wideness, or the sense of conscious awareness, or the sense of a depth, or a light, or a love, or just a presence, or power. And one can dwell on these different aspects to make the experience more complete and more stable. Then comes another layer of it. Now, so far it knew itself, and the other things felt in relation to it as ephemeral or superficial. But when you are more settled in it, it now looks at everything in terms of its values and begins to translate them into its terms. So now the third phase of deepening. So, knows all that is in itself in the same way, by identity with it. I am one with the knowledge, I am one with the presence, I am one with the peace or power. And next, third stage, begins even to see all that to our mind seems external in the same manner. So far in my mind, I felt this as if like a backdrop within me, behind me, or somehow filling the whole universe, but as if like a vast container against which what is inside the container feels unreal. There are all different variations of the same experience. And from any one of them you can develop widen it or complete it into the other. But now it begins to seep into everything. All this ephemerality of the world begins to be filled with it. So begins even to see all that to our mind seems external. So far to the mind that was within, this was outside. So from the within now you turn to the outside. By a movement of identity or by an intrinsic direct consciousness. So first, it takes two forms. First, it could simply be, it is there, in it. I look at the flower, it is in it. I look at the wall, it is in it. I look at a person. The person is not conscious of it, but it is in it. It is conscious. Just directly, it fills everything, and so that's done. A sense of identity, I feel it. Or it can be a progressive entry. And this is more interesting. Because here is the sequence by which you can extend from that consciousness the embrace to this consciousness. So, intrinsic direct consciousness which envelops, penetrates, enters into its object. So from that poise, when you are in that consciousness, you look at something else. And after a while, there's the sense of embracement. Again, it takes two forms. One where you feel it embraces the whole universe, but is somehow beyond the universe. And inside the universe is so ephemeral. Or the same feeling can be towards an object. I look at the flower and I concentrate to feel that. And first I feel it enveloping this surrounding. And then penetrating, entering into its object. But it's not yet complete until it becomes one. So the last stage of this, after entering, discovers itself in the object, is aware in it of something that is not mind or life or body. And now suddenly I feel that equally inside the object as it was within me or behind supporting the universe or me. It is equally inside. And at that point when you ask to describe what is inside, no, it's not the body, it's not the life force. And if it's inside a person, it's not even his mind or his thought, it's something fundamentally different. As it was within you, fundamentally different. So you see how in a very quick summary form, Sri Aurobindo has described all the variations of the experience which make for this decisive coming out, emergence of the spiritual. When this has come, what do you call it? It's not mind, it's not life, it's not body. Well, it is spirit. How do you feel it? Not by your physical senses, not by your emotions, not by your thoughts, but by its own power of perceiving itself. It is its own evidence. So when somebody asks, I'm feeling this, how do I know it is the spirit or the soul? Mothers reply simply, well, if you're asking, then it's not it. When it has come into its own, you cannot ask because you already know it knows itself. The evidence is within it. When you are asking, it's because your consciousness is still not in it, but from the mind or the heart, you perceive something which has a feel of it, a first preliminary stage. But when it has come decisively, the question is gone. You know it. Even if you're not in it fully, you know it came upon me and it was so overwhelming, so concrete, so real, so much more real than anything I've experienced. You don't have words which belong to the domain of thought, emotion, or body. There is then evidently a spiritual consciousness. Now the evidence is there, that's why evidently, which is other than the mental. And it testifies to the existence of a spiritual being in us, which is other than our surface mental personality. So now this has led us to a new recognition. If there is this spiritual consciousness, there is a spiritual being. How do you know that? Because the part in you which is living in it is not mind, life, body, but it's still you. So it is your being but now you're a spiritual being. So you did not necessarily think of it as yours. Initially, when the experience came, it could have been something so wide, so vast, so overwhelming that you say, it is that. So very often, and we've seen this in people at an initial experience of such a kind, they will say something like, I found myself this small person, and then there was that vast, large other being, godlike, but yet it felt as if it was me. Strange. You're so much here that it looks like other, and yet the sense inside, because a part of you feels identity in it, it felt like it was me. And then you shift. You begin to be more familiar, and then it is more of you in that, less of you in this. Until at some point you are so deeply seated in that only occasionally it needs a strong impulse to pull you out of it and exteriorize you in the surface part. But even then you can quickly get back. So clearly the sense is there of a spiritual being other than the surface mental personality. And yet it's in us, it is us. But at first, this consciousness may confine itself to a status of being separate from the action of our ignorant surface nature, observing it, limiting itself to knowledge, to a seeing of things with a spiritual sense and a vision of existence. When first this kind of thing happens, it does not immediately engage. It's there and it's just waiting. So one of the forms in which I've heard the description, someone says, it felt like it was waiting for me to catch up, to wake up. And meanwhile, I am this little person doing my little things in my little rounds, which now seem so meaningless or silly or superficial. And that is wise, waiting. It feels something so old and mature, and it's just waiting for this little kid to play on, get tired of its play, and finally wake up and align itself to the much more important thing that it wants to do. So from outside, there is this distinct sense. Or if you are seated within it, then there is the distinct sense that all this nature is going on mechanically. I'm talking, I'm doing, and all those things, but I am not these things. I am free, standing back. So, it may confine itself. It's as if it puts a limit on its own relation or interference with the surface part. Observing, limiting itself to knowledge, to a seeing of things with a spiritual sense and vision of existence. The very fact that it sees from a deeper poise, its value system is different. What is a spiritual sense? Recall the earlier discussion of right action. When you look at the world and you recognize there must be something which is true. And to the spiritual sense, it's obvious. The true value of things. The true value of your momentary desire. Nothing. You know it will pass in a moment. You even know next moment it will be the very opposite you will want. All these things have zero value. The true value of my relationships, so far I said, oh, so and so is my child, my family, my cousin, my tribe, my nationality. And you look at that, well, I'm so petty, so immature. Because when you look from the spiritual perspective, I've taken birth in all these cultures, in all kinds of families, and even in my relationships between these XYZ, I have perhaps met them once as friend, as family, as enemy, as anything. None of these relations of human values have any intrinsic merit. But from the deeper poise of the self's vision, there is a deeper relationship. We are all together in this common effort for awakening to a new consciousness, for bringing it onto earth something that is waiting to manifest, for serving the divine will, or whatever the values that the forms of the values may take. If I am an artist, what I create to sell will make me a lot of money, and maybe it's important because I need to feed myself. But in terms of its value, to create something which will capture a glimpse of that immortal or infinite or eternal and give to it a form of expression, that is worthwhile. To create something which represents the divine or gives an entry for the divine expression, that is worthwhile. So, the spiritual sense looks at all these things and chooses and immediately recognizes the value. The spiritual sense and vision of existence. For action, it may still depend upon the mental, vital, bodily instruments, or it may allow them to act according to their own nature and itself remain satisfied with self-experience and self-knowledge. So at this point, two forms of relationship with the outer personality. In one, it depends on them. Now I feel this wonderful, great, vast freedom, and when I need to express, this work needs to be done, it will be through my old mold of limited capacity of thought, expression, language, skills of power, human relations. And what happens is, I have a deep ideal, vision, I move to express it, I lose it. I mess it up in the expression. I step back to rest in the great vision, and then again an interaction, there's a mix. So it is dependent on those limited instruments, or it can stay back supporting. They continue according to their nature with an inner liberation and eventual freedom. Eventually though. But it may also and usually does exercise a certain authority, governance, influence on thought, life movement, physical action, a purifying, uplifting control, compelling them to move in a higher and purer truth of themselves, to obey or be an instrumentation of an influx of some diviner power or a luminous direction which is not mental but spiritual and can be recognized as having a certain divine character. All this, again, you will see multiple stages. So first level, it may also occasionally and usually does exercise a certain authority. So the first thing that you will see, when you distinguish between deeper values and superficial values, even without any effort of influence, the influence has already happened. The moment you felt the deeper value and you felt the futility of the superficial value, automatically you will tend to slant. No special pressure is required, no special choice is required, you can't help it. So that's why it says, usually does exercise a certain authority, governance, influence. So first level is authority, where it knows better, but it didn't do anything. Second level is, it knows better and now it is governing. And third level, where it extends its influence and directly impacts. So in governance, what does a governor do? If you look at the political arrangement, the governor is there only to step in when things go outside the constitutional boundaries, but does not dictate the details. So from authority, where it knows what is best, it has a governance where it puts out as if certain limits, certain priorities, to a third degree where an influence is there, sustaining, molding, shaping on thought, life movements and physical action, all three layers. And with it, something else which is much more important, a purifying, uplifting control, compelling them. So far, influence did not involve compulsion or control. So the next degree of action is control and compulsion, but in the control and compulsion, it's not making you do what it wants. You are not a robot. and an automaton. Rather, the control is to bring this purifying, uplifting influence. That it will refuse actively a lowering influence. It will actively push towards a purifying influence, compelling them to move in a higher and purer truth of themselves. It does not make mind obey. It makes mind become more true to itself, but by purifying and turning to mind's higher truth. What is mind's higher truth? In one of the famous statements, truth is beauty, beauty truth. For mind, what is true is its divinity. For matter, what is beautiful is its divinity. And equally for the heart and life, there's a sense of true, and which is the sense of the sacred in all things. Traditionally in yoga, the three words which are associated with these three: Satyam, which is truth; Shivam, the auspicious or sacred; and Sundaram, the beautiful. These are the three ways in which we recognize or express divinity in the world through these three instruments. But so the uplifting towards the purer and higher truth of themselves, each becomes more truly mind, more truly the emotions, more truly the body and its working. Not spirit forcing them to become like it. To obey or be an instrumentation of an influx of some diviner power. So this takes it to next level. So far it was purifying them to become more truly themselves. When the purification is sufficiently developed, now it brings them under control of a higher power. To obey or be an instrumentation of an influx. Influx is the higher power now coming into a lower power of mind, life or body. It is not the higher power in itself. It enters, necessarily therefore it can withdraw. Necessarily therefore in the entry there will be a mixture. But in that mixture, the existing mind either has to obey or becoming an instrument. Again, there are 2 degrees of difference here. In the first level there's an obedience. I know I should do this. It's clear I have to obey. But I do it by myself, with my personal effort. In the second degree, I know I should do it, and the thing which I should do, or the part which knows, fills me, pushes me and acts through me, I am an instrument. In obeying, there is an authority and there is the obedient part which is separate. In becoming an instrument, the authority fills and acts or leads the action from inside. The first is the status of servant. An order is given by the master and you follow. The second approaches more closely, not yet completely, the status of slave. You have no personal separate choice of your own. What that chooses fills you and acts in you and through you. To obey or be an instrumentation of an influx of some diviner power. And he doesn't say the highest divine, a diviner, and there will be many stages, bit by bit. Or a luminous direction which is not mental but spiritual and can be recognized as having a certain divine character. So, difference again, diviner power versus luminous direction which is not mental. And in the quality of the experience, the power as if fills you and acts through you, but it may not necessarily give to you the knowledge. Why, how, and what's the difference between this or that. It just does, it leads, and it makes you do. When in the most, for examples, it's always good to look at the more extreme examples. When Joan of Arc felt the power seizing her, The power led her to say things, to see and say and do things, which if she was told, now do this, she would have said impossible. Anybody would have said impossible. But the power seizing her, making her an instrument, could do it. But there's a different kind of action where it is a luminous direction. It is not the power aspect of the divine, but the light, knowledge, awareness which fills. And in that, you know first. The drive is not so strong, the knowledge is stronger. So, luminous direction, I know it has to be like this. And I know I have to go in this way. I even know what will happen when those problems come and how I have to deal with it. But the power component is not strong and I have to largely rely on my own energy. But the knowledge is clear. Luminous direction, which is not mental but spiritual. And you have to distinguish now. Because you could have said, oh, I know in a mental way, but here there's a very different character of knowing. It's as if lit up. I know spontaneously, as if in a grade that is its own evidence. Unlike mind which knows but can doubt and question what it knows, this knowing doesn't have the option of doubt because already it knows what it knows and what it doesn't know. So which is not mental but spiritual and can be recognized as having a certain divine character. You can feel in it the character of the divinity in the knowledge part. So you see here, the flow of that inspiration can come in two forms. As a diviner power or as a luminous direction. Eventually though, the two things will join and one will be seen as an aspect of the other. But initially we are, again according to our temperament, aligned to one or the other. And both of these he now describes as the inspiration of a greater self or the command of the ruler of all being, the Ishvara. So from where did this inspiration come? And again, two facets to the experience. In the first facet, it is our own self. Greater self than my little self, false self, ego self, superficial self, but the greater self, capital S, from where the inspiration comes. And the other side is command of the Ishvara, ruler of all being. It is not myself, it is the Lord, the divine, God, some sense of a supra-cosmic being, not I. Although I may be a part of it or a child of it or having a special relation with it, but not I, greater than I. The two are again facets of the same experience because as we discover, our self is one with the cosmic self, is one with the divine, the Ishvara. But we can experience this as if from within individually, or we can experience it objectively outside as if that divinity outside. What's the difference between the two? Essentially, it is whether your temperament is more inwardly connected to the divine or more outwardly connected to the divine. And you could have both even at the same time. So inwardly, because subjectively one feels I am that is self. Outwardly, it is the self of the universe or Lord of the universe, ruler of all being. And so there is an objectification, objectivizing. And your relationship, yet you feel is I am one with that, but as a child or as a part. Sri Aurobindo uses this word Ishvara and literally translates as ruler of all being. Isha, the root, means the owner, possessor, lord. And Sri Aurobindo explains in his commentary on the Isha Upanishad, the whole purpose of lordship or ownership is to possess, and the purpose of possession is enjoyment of possession. So this is the aspect of the divine, Ishvara, who possesses the whole universe, not only as the ruler, but also who enters into the universe, immanent in the universe, and enjoys himself in everything in the universe. And therefore everything in the universe has him as Lord and ruler, as Ishvara. And so his command, although as if coming from the divine, is the command at the same time of your deepest being, of your deepest truth. And there is no sense of separation, of something which is a taskmaster that you have to obey. The religions caught this deep truth, but in the way the religions formulated themselves, often with the idea of fear, reward, punishment, etc. in the relationship, or a divine law which is mentalized that you have now to read from a book or listen from an authority and obey, the sense of that deep closeness with the divine as yourself is lost. And often then the divine or God takes on the form of being almost a tyrannical authority. When you have the deep experience of the divine being yourself, or yourself being one in the divine, with the divine, all of those things vanish, which you do find in the acme of each of these religions. Particularly in the Abrahamic religion, the sense of servitude to God or obedience to God is very strong. And so the separation also becomes very strong, and then God is very quickly turned into a monstrosity or a perverse authority. But in each of those traditions, if you go to the mystic experiences the oneness with the divine and experiences the divine will as working within him as his own deepest truth and will. And when they speak of it, there is such deep love and self-giving to the divine. And you see those mystics, and then you see the formal teaching of the authority of the church or the hierarchy of priests, and they're so different. And that is why the breakthrough in the traditions of any religion is through their mystical and through their esoteric traditions, and not through the formal hierarchical structures which tend to pervert things. So I use this, I expanded on this because otherwise the sense of ruler of all being can be misconstrued. So all of these have described one line of experience. But Sri Aurobindo is thorough. He describes all possible facets of experience. So separately from these, which involved a direct experience of the self and the spiritual consciousness and presence of the self, is the entry through the psychic awakening to the divine. So, or the nature may obey the psychic entity's intimations, move in an inner light, follow an inner guidance. You experience that perhaps, but that does not directly act on your nature. It's rather the psychic presence which is closest to your nature, which is embedded in your nature, which holds the essentiality both of your mind and of your life and even of your body. It is from there that the intimations come. Nature obeys the psychic entity's intimation, move in an inner light, follow an inner guidance, and it can have a almost smooth, soft spontaneity to nature accepting the psychic influence. In practice in the integral yoga, both movements take place. We try as far as possible to increase nature's obedience to the psychic influence through that action, which is the psychicization, which makes possible the more direct infusion of inspiration, of power or knowledge from above, which leads and makes the nature an instrument for its work. The two together working, of course, make for the smoothest and most effective action. But this or nature may obey psychic intimation is a different line, and he says this is already a considerable evolution and amounts to a beginning at least of a psychic and spiritual transformation. But it is possible to go farther. The journey doesn't end here. This is, he has called the beginning, at least, of a psychic and spiritual transformation. See, when the intimations come, the inspirations come, the power acts, the knowledge flows, the mind cannot remain the same. Your life parts necessarily undergo a change from the very fact that they're infused with something frequently or intensely, even if not frequently, and the beginning of transformation in terms of that, either the psychic or the spiritual. But the transformation is only begun. What will be the greater transformation? But it is possible to go farther. For the spiritual being, once inwardly liberated, can develop in mind the higher states of being that are its own natural atmosphere and bring down a spiritual energy and action which are proper to the truth consciousness. So at this point, the spiritual being has access to its own higher states. It brings them into the mind, uses mind as an instrument. But it can also focus upon the mind and change the character of the mind itself. Open the mind to its own higher possibilities and higher states of being, which correspond to the states of the spiritual being. So what is interesting here is things which are natural to the spiritual being, which are not yet developed in the mind, are possible to the mind in its higher ranges. And so it can actually act on mind and awaken in mind those states and develop their powers. At that point, something extraordinary is happening. The working of the mind itself changes. It's not just an instrument. It's not just a vehicle for that to act. It now begins to act in its own right and begins to get spiritualized in its own right, which makes it then a more effective instrument for the spirit. Now, this is a key point Aurobindo makes. So far, what he described, you will see common to many spiritual traditions. The idea that a higher spiritual consciousness or the will of God or a higher spiritual inspiration pours through, acts through you, does its thing. But, Aurobindo points out, when it acts, your mind is still the same mind. Although momentarily filled with a light, it is still working as it is capable of working. And its working is inherently a power of division, of limitation. So a great experience comes which belongs to the domain of infinity, but when it acts through mind, it gets cut up and broken up. And although powerful in its action and although true in its action, in its origin, in the form into which it gets translated by the cutting up through mind, it has lost something. It has diminished. It has broken up. And so are we to accept that anytime you manifest the divine consciousness through mind, you must always lose or distort it? And this is the point Aurobindo makes, that's not necessary. But here is where he exceeds all existing traditions, because they don't have this concept that the mind is capable of becoming a divinized mind, that your life energies can also be divinized and even your body eventually divinized. And as it grows in divinization, the mind can become an instrument of the infinity, capable of now manifesting the infinity even without breaking it up, without distorting it. How far can it go in that direction? That is the point Aurobindo is leading us to. It is possible to go farther, for the spiritual being, once inwardly liberated, can develop in mind the higher states of being that are its own natural atmosphere and bring down a supra-mental energy and action which are proper to the truth consciousness. The ordinary mental instrumentation, life instrumentation, physical instrumentation, even, because that's the last, even, could then be entirely transformed and become parts no longer of an ignorance, however much illumined, but of a supra-mental creation which would be the true action of a spiritual truth consciousness and a knowledge. Now we will look at this in much greater detail next Sunday, but for now, simply this idea that so far the transformation, whatever one could conceive of the mind, life, or body, was a spiritual illumination, spiritual inspiration, but only a larger awakening, still in ignorance. Lesser ignorance, but nevertheless in ignorance. And this can go a long way. So far that in fact you will say, this person is now a god. Not just demigod, he has become a god. So it seems from the human consciousness. But the person is capable of ignorance. And at that point, with that great brilliance of power and knowledge, the ignorance can be cosmic. And this is what Sri Aurobindo has explained. They are often the basis of religions, which see one aspect of the divine and not another aspect, and get stuck in that one aspect which is so overwhelming. They are the overmental deities which are the source of this kind of divine action, divine revelation, but limited in an aspect. And that cannot be done by, the correction of this cannot be done by any power of the mind or spirit, except the supramental, which is a power of oneness. Only that descending, taking up, lifting the instrumentation and transforming, which can take it out from the domain of ignorance completely. So now we have come to the conclusion of the whole spiritual evolution. Remember, mind as it disengaged from life, came and built its own life, and then took life and changed life. Took body and changed it to whatever limited extent it could. So to spirit now, emerging out of mind, coming into its own through all these stages we saw today, now turns upon mind, life, body, changes them, taking them as far as they can go, but at its last it can bring in the supramental, which actually lift them out of the domain of ignorance fundamentally. This possibility is inconceivable based on all past evolution, because it could never have been done by any of the powers of evolution so far. It can be done by power of spirit, but not just any power of spirit. The highest power of spirit, what is called the supramental, alone has this power to completely pull out of ignorance. And at that point, what kind of a being are you looking at? Entirely free even from the tiniest stain of ignorance. And such a being, embodied eventually, however long that eventuality takes, embodied, living in a body where the body itself does not have a stain of ignorance. What could that be? And Sri Aurobindo does not get into the speculation of that at all here. Simply that it can go to this extent because it is possible from the fully liberated power of the supramental. It is this which brings to the acme of the spiritual evolution. What will such a being do? What values will it be live by? What will its actions be like beyond our conception? But from that extreme poise to where we are, you see, even in the decisive emergence of spirituality and further are so many steps. Each of them brings you out a step, free from ignorance, but not entirely liberated, bound still to some limited, reduced ignorance. Now, this having completed the big picture of what it means for the spiritual being to emerge out of the mind and the power it will have on the mind and the rest of the earlier instruments, the next question is, what are the methods? What are the processes by which this emergence will take place? So far we described the emergence, but what's the actual process by which this will take place? And that becomes the rest of the discussion for most of the rest of the chapter, which we will continue next Sunday. You see, the documentation in this way, in such detail, with all the nuances of the experience, does not exist in any existing literature. In the Veda, you will find all these experiences described, but not in this way. They are described by an intuitive consciousness that is articulating the experience as it goes along, but to summarize it in this form, in a rational mental form that the current modern mind can read and say, that's what it means, that has not been done before. And just the fact that it is documented in such a comprehensive way, nothing is left out. All the major aspects of all the passages, paths of emergence of the spiritual being out of mind have been outlined here. And then the power of the spirit on mind, life, body has been documented, has been described to its acme, to literally transform them entirely. It's never been done before. All of the religions have had glimpses of these things or have looked at certain paths, certain passages and said, this is the only way it can happen. Another religion says, this is the only way. Even many mystical and esoteric traditions, each caught in its own particular passage, but falling short of this complete transformation in their vision. A divine body, yes, but in a different substance, in a higher world, in a heaven, not this body. The fact that even the physical body can be liberated from ignorance has never been conceived of. But Sri Aurobindo is not just presenting it as a possibility and not just as an imagination, but as an assured result by the very logic of the emergence of the spirit and the relationship of spirit with mind, life and body. And so logically, he has shown this as the outcome and the inevitability of this outcome. And just that, if we can assimilate and hold and keep as the whole reason, the raison d'être of our birth on earth, of this lifetime, even the purpose of this lifetime, and not just this lifetime, but all the lifetimes that we have been struggling through to come to where we are, where we can look at this and understand this and resonate with this truth from our deepest and highest parts as a living vision and even a conviction of the truth, and dedicate ourselves entirely to this. This possibility is given to us in this life. It was not there before because it had not been articulated in this way before, because humanity was not ready for it before. And that's why reading this and the assurance it gives us makes this life and the conviction and dedication that we can give to this life so valuable, so precious. So to read this, to let it seep into the very pores of our being to whatever extent we can, and the conviction and power of the conviction, and then to dedicate our lives for this. And it doesn't matter afterwards how long it takes, because every step will be progressively the emergence of the spiritual being and its progressive growth of freedom and joy in light and delight. It may take a few lives, doesn't matter, but every day will be a joyous growth towards this. And so the next paragraph begins like this. This, however, imposes a difficult and slow spiritual advance. For the spiritual emergence has to wait at each step for the instruments to be ready. Next, the spiritual formation emerges. And so he's describing now all these things. Slow spiritual advance, or so it seems. And then he will show us how even that slowness is on the basis of the previous methods of evolution. And when we bring in the power of the spirit and the methods of the spirit in the evolution now, even this, what seems to be slow and difficult advance, enormously speeds up and becomes easy. And when we look at those methods of the spirit and incorporate those methods as the very processes of our yoga and sadhana, and they become the foundation of the integral yoga, then suddenly it not only makes so much more sense, it is not only so much more practical, but so much more easy that Sri Aurobindo can even declare that for the effort that one has to put, the results that one gets in relation to the effort put, it is the easiest yoga ever formulated. So all this will be our exploration in the coming months, and we continue this next Sunday.